All right, so we're beginning the second session of today's meetings. The title of the issue to be discussed is Contemporary Jewish Cultural Creativity in Israel and the Diaspora, actually the English-speaking diaspora, Convergence or Divergence. And we have a very distinguished panel of speakers from Israel and abroad to discuss the issues, which, given the prominence of writers, of Jewish writers and writers in Israel and their cultural importance over the last 50 years, I think this is a subject that should be extremely fascinating. Like everybody else, I want to say one word about Gidi. I know it's becoming embarrassing for him, and maybe it's becoming a bore for everybody else. But there's only one. You won't be getting another conference like this, I shouldn't think. And I'm speaking from personal experience because I went through this a few years ago. What I would like to say is that Gidi, I think, is one of those unusual colleagues who actually excels in his own quiet way in every aspect of being an academic, that is a university teacher and researcher. His published work is of the highest level, and he published one classic book, as well as many other books. He's known, as you've heard, as being an extremely good teacher at the popular level, including outside the university framework, being a devoted supervisor of students. And one thing that maybe hasn't been stressed, he never shunned university administrative work, which tends to be extremely unrewarding, can be extremely trying. He did it extremely successfully, including being head of the Institute of Contemporary Jewry, running innumerable seminars and projects. All these things he did successfully. It's very unusual. Most of us manage to do at least one thing probably reasonably well, either research or teaching or administration. To do them all is unusual. And from that point of view, it's a great honor to be involved in this conference. Our first speaker is Menahem Brinker, who has been a colleague of ours at the Hebrew University for many years. He's one of the small number among us who's received the Israel Prize, quite deservedly. He's professor of philosophy and Hebrew literature here for decades, before that at Tel Aviv University. And he was also for years visiting professor at Chicago, the Henry Crown Professor of Modern Hebrew Studies in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at the University of Chicago. His subject, the distinctiveness of Israeli literature among other Jewish literatures. Thanks.
I met Gidi outside the academy as soldiers. I met Gidi outside the academy. We both served as soldiers of the reserve at educational officer of the IDF, K'tzin Chinuch, and we both were called to explain what Zionism is to soldiers, not always eager to learn what Zionism is. Usually the call would come like this: "Hello, זה ברוקנר? אתה בציונות?" I said, "No, I am lecturer at the university." בציונות? לא, בספרות ובפילוסופיה. אז למה כתוב לי פה בציונות? And then after talks like that, I'll meet Gidi, which was brought to the army more or less with the same conditions, and our meetings, except for his book that I read, and perhaps some of my essays that he read, our meetings were usually outdoors and in connection with military service, and you will see that I'll manage to introduce nature and wars into my paper, honoring him. And, you know, old soldiers, also old teachers, never retire. It's just a myth. It's not a reality, it's a myth, yeah. To talk on the distinctness of Israeli Hebrew literature compared to literary works written by Jews in other languages and in other countries, and to say about it something new beyond the obvious is in a sense to measure expectations against realities. The obvious is, of course, the language. Israel had been for some decades the only place where literary works are written in Hebrew, after the death of Gabriel Preil, perhaps. A little bit less obvious is the fact that not only Jews participate in this recent stage of Hebrew literary history, as in all normal countries, normal literatures, English, French, or Russian, Hebrew Israeli literature too is created today by the members of more than one ethnic group. There are Arab novelists and essayists, both Christian and Muslims, and there are even more Arab and Druze poets that write in Hebrew, sometimes in addition to the writing in another language, usually Arabic, and sometimes exclusively in Hebrew. This, of course, is far from being a trivial fact, and as it is an unprecedented phenomenon in Hebrew literary history, it carries with it many implications for the future development of Hebrew literature and its distinctness. As a result of this, in everything concerning the present and the future of Hebrew literature, we can really use interchangeably the terms Israeli literature and Hebrew literature, since there is no more Hebrew literature outside Israel. We used to have, but we do not have today, Hebrew stories or poems written by Yordim, though we did have them not so long ago, but no more. So everything points into a normalization of relationship between literature, language, and territory. And this factor itself, both in its negative and its positive aspects, point to a certain Zionist fulfillment. One country, one language, perhaps also one literature for the Jews and of the Jews. One may really put in serious question whether anything written in fiction and poetry outside Israel, and outside, so to speak, the Hebrew language, is part of the literature of the Jews, though it is literature written by, produced by Jews. It is one thing to say that Kafka or Bruno Schulz or Saul Bellow are Jewish writers, and Paul Celan is a Jewish poet. One thing even to say that their works exhibit Jewish sensibilities or display Jewish motives and Jewish characters, and quite another thing to say that their works are part of the literature of the Jews, of one literature of the Jews, rather than part of American or German or Polish literature, part of these literatures which is written by Jews and whose Jewish specificity within the context of these literatures has to be shown and studied. Though these bear clear implications to the general topic of this conference, I shall not discuss it here. It is a vexed question to my taste. I'll return it hesitantly at the end of my paper. What I do want to discuss is the distinctness of Hebrew literature in its present stage, the Israeli stage. 100 years ago, the most significant literary critics of Hebrew literature, of modern Hebrew literature, held special expectations about the novels and poems that will be written in Hebrew in the land of Israel. David Frischman, a non-Zionist and even an early secular anti-Zionist Hebrew writer, thought that all literature written in the diaspora suffers some hindrance that prevent it from producing veritable great masterpieces. He considered Bialik, Mendele, and Yalag the greater writers, but even them didn't achieve veritable greatness, which was an important category for him. And because it was written on a land that didn't belong to the language, and there was no community living on one land that speaks the language. Joseph Kloisner thought that only a connection to a national territory in the land of Israel can initiate Hebrew writers and poets to create strong and healthy literary works of universal rather than merely Jewish value. More intelligent critics, to my mind, like the literary intellectuals, writers, and literary critics Berdichevsky and Brenner, had more favorable views of the literary works produced in the diaspora by the giants of Hebrew literature, especially Mendel and Bialik, and lesser expectations of a sudden revolution in terms of poetic achievement once the Zionist dream is realized. But they too had expectations of at least a more natural literature and healthier literary atmosphere once the writers will sit on their own land, and especially once the Hebrew language will become the language of a living community. Skeptic as they were about a full-fledged Hebrew Renaissance, they articulated their hope that in the midst of an Hebrew-speaking community, which almost by definition would produce new Jewish persons, or Hebrew persons, these were interchangeably expressions, new Jewish persons or Hebrew persons, in such a community, Hebrew literature will have more to offer to its readers. After nearly 100 years of Hebrew literary activity in Palestine or the land of Israel, I use these terms interchangeably, one can doubt all these early predictions in everything that relates to poetic or aesthetic merit or value. There is indeed no point in comparing Agnon or Izhar to Mendele or Berdichevsky, no point in comparing Amichai or Alterman to Bialik. Yet exaggerated as they were, these early ideological expectations of the literature that will be written in this land had an enormous impact on the nature of the literature itself that was produced in Israel, both before and after the establishment of the state. Because of the specific heavy ideological claims made in regard to modern Hebrew literature, beginning with the Hebrew Enlightenment, when Hebrew literature had to become the agent of Jewish emancipation, both external emancipation and internal emancipation, Hebrew literature had a peculiar, and ending with Zionism, when it had to become the agent of auto-emancipation, Hebrew literature had a peculiar literary history, wholly different and out of step with the evolution of almost all other European literatures. For example, Romanticism came as late to Hebrew literature as the end of the 19th century. Neoclassicism was still the leading trend at the middle of the 19th century, long after it gave way to Romanticism in the European literatures. And there was almost no symbolism or decadence in the fin de siècle, no fin de siècle trend at the turn of the centuries from the 19th century to the 20th century in Hebrew literature. These specific conditions, or if you prefer, these abnormalities in relation, if you take the normal case, the evolution of French literature or Russian or English, are still shaping the nature of Hebrew literature and especially Hebrew fiction that is written today in Israel. One central example is the role of descriptions of nature in literary works. At the end of the 19th century, when nobody wrote any more long autobiographical poems or whole chapters of fictional narrative devoted mostly to the depiction of nature, Bialik or Mendele or Chernyakhovsky still gained much praise for precisely the abundance of such patient and detailed descriptions of nature in their works. And deeply into the 20th century, and even the late 20th century, Izhar and Shamir, as well as Amos Oz or Meir Shalev or David Grossman, will include in their work large segments of nature descriptions so untypical of the English or French realistic novels written at the same time. We understand that this is a part of the heritage of the Hebrew revival, and that there is a double or even a triple ideological bonus involved here. First, ability to describe nature faithfully, whatever it means, required an enriched vocabulary and an enriched language. So the ability of creating such descriptions witnessed the progress in the modernization and revival of the Hebrew language. Secondly, the Hebrew, or the new Jewish person, had to free himself of the yoke of the book by learning to study and celebrate nature, by becoming close to it or into intimate terms with it. Thirdly, the detailed descriptions of a landscape was also the discovery of the land of Israel, part and parcel of the Jewish national renewal and Zionism. Here, literature shared a parallel development with other arts in the earlier stages of the ingathering in Israel, like the visual arts and music. The return to the Oriental inspiration was so important for early songs written in the land of Israel, and Bezalel and mixing of the Jugendstil together with Oriental motives in painting and sculpture. Now, when we witness parallel trends in various arts, we tend to speak of the zeitgeist or the cultural climate of the epoch, or some other such monistic, all-explaining terms. Yet there is no need to use such terms. One of the best contributors of Russian, the Prague Semiotic School, and French structuralism is that in order to explain such parallels between arts, you do not have to postulate semi-metaphysical monistic entities. You can study the evolution of each art as an autonomous system as long as you remember that each cultural system is exposed to the influence of other cultural systems. Social ideologies are also a cultural system, and it so happens that at the turn of the centuries, this particular cultural system, the ideological one, was the most dominant one in the evolution of Jewish culture taken as a whole. The impact of this period is still recognizable in all Israeli arts, and especially in literature, that because of its dealing with words and its intimate connection to the modernization or revival of an antique and rarely spoken language, was the most susceptible of being influenced by social ideologies. If you look for this specific trait, the high place specific trait like the high place ascribed to descriptions of nature in both the writing and the evaluation of literary works, this one example that I picked is as one typical trait of modern Hebrew literature in general and Israeli literature in particular. You will find one important peculiar trait that clearly separates Israeli writing of literary works of art from other works of art written by writers outside Israel, including almost all Jewish, German Jewish, French Jewish, or American Jewish writers. Another important aspect of the distinctness of Israeli writers and poets, among all other Jewish writers and poets, is their complex attitude to war. And this, of course, is due not only to the impact of ideologies, but to Israeli realities as such, and to the realities of the lives of the writers and poets themselves. The attitude of almost all Jewish writers of some significance outside Israel towards war is wholly critical and negative, an attitude of moral protest against its absurdities. This relates not only to such condemnable wars as the Vietnam War, but also to the conduct and the atmosphere of the Second World War. Think of Joseph Heller or Norman Mailer. Jewish writers always encountered war both in their writing and outside their art as protesters. There was very rarely some complexity or ambiguity in their relation to this aspect of human reality. War, any war, meant almost always for them nothing beside a human catastrophe. Now we must remember that this is not the only possible moral attitude towards war as such. Philosophers and other thinkers, especially those that placed ethical values at the top of the hierarchy of human values and considered moral experience as above any other kind of human experience, very often praised war, even glorified it. This is true not only of Gentile thinkers like Kant or Fichte or Hegel, but also of Jewish thinkers like Hermann Cohen, Martin Buber, at least at a certain point of his career, and Rabbi Kook. War was seen by them as a reality that encourages non-egoistic behavior, group solidarity, readiness to sacrifice one's property, even one's life, for some higher superpersonal principle. The elevating moments of war were never celebrated only by extreme nationalists or fascists. They were celebrated by moralists as well. Yet the more important Jewish writers outside Israel never included these moments in their accounts of war. In Israel, the situation is somewhat different, and not only in popular culture, such as the patriotic songs industry or official and semi-official journalists, writers singing the praise of this or that general. Most serious Israeli novelists' depictions of war are far more nuanced, complex, and ambiguous than the depictions of war given by other Jewish writers. War, with all its brutalities and necessary and unnecessary evils, cannot be for them just an ongoing display of absurdity. With Izhar, Natan Shacham, A.B. Yeshua, Amos Oz, or Yeshua Knaz, there is of course always some voice of protest against God, or history, or destiny, or the leaders and the politics. But there is also the acknowledgement or even celebration of human solidarity, sometimes a feeling of the fatalism of the inevitable, or the sober recognition of the necessity of war. When the moral issue presents itself for these writers, or in the works of these writers, it is presented in most cases in the form of a doubt, a suspicion, a question, a problem that cannot be solved, rather in the form of a non-ambiguous outright condemnation. Israeli poetry presents a different picture, true. There you will find many poems that express sheer disgust, but typically enough, these were written during the Lebanon First War and not during the 48 or 67 or 73 wars. Before the First Lebanon War, there were poems of lamentation by Natan Zach or Amir Gilboa, of celebration by Chaim Guri or Abba Kovner, even of annoyance, especially by Amichai, who presented war always as a serious and brutal interruption of love and lovemaking, and love itself and lovemaking as the only partial remedy, helping to break the cyclical curse of the return of war. The Lebanon War stopped the trend of the major poets of the 50s and the 60s to stay away, far away from politics and all public affairs. Almost all the major poets protested in their work, and those that did not found other ways to express their protest. Here we come in touch with Israeli life and that surrounds literary works of art and goes beyond them. The nuanced response to the reality of the cyclical return of war was not limited to literature and to works of literature. It occupied the writers also as citizens. It had to be so because of the tensions and complexities of life itself. Both as citizens and as artists, the Israeli writers, unlike Jewish writers dealing with war elsewhere, could not simply glorify or condemn war per se. They had to accept social responsibility and enter into details, condemning this war and justifying another war, condemning a certain event or behavior, questioning another, and showing understanding towards other events or behaviors. They could never entertain the illusion that as artists, novelists, or poets, they represent a superior moral court and pass crucial judgments above the heads and the authority of ordinary citizens. Most of them participated personally in the military events as fighters or commanders, and not as writers, military historians, lecturers, or educators. Of course, in the writing, you could hear echoes of earlier periods of Hebrew literary history, the Bible, medieval Hebrew poetry, and other sources of Hebrew literature, but this intertextual relatedness was usually exploited to stress the newness of the Israeli situation and their own personal situation within it, rather than to display the harmonious continuity of Jewish history. A language and a literature of 26 or 27 centuries serve them well to stress their complete modernity or even postmodernity. Discussing just these two themes, nature, attitude towards nature and towards war, and in passing the all-important issue of language, I think I said enough to show the distinctness of Israeli fiction and poetry. Perhaps also enough to suggest that this distinctness is directly and indirectly tied to the peculiar and unprecedented nature of the Israeli experience as a Jewish experience. In light of this consideration, it is very difficult, indeed impossible, to consider Jewish extraterritorial or superlinguistic literature as one big literature that goes beyond territorial frontiers and linguistic barriers. If we take literature as a possible clue or key to answer the question central to this conference, whether Jewish peoplehood is a myth or a reality, the answer must be negative. Jewish literary creativity everywhere is closer to the literary history of the languages in which Jewish writers write. Though, for example, Isaac Babel was born in Odessa, a cultural center of both Hebrew and Yiddish culture, and knew Yiddish and even Hebrew well enough, his ties to Anton Chekhov are more significant than the similarities of his work to Sholem Aleichem or Mendele, citizens at a certain point of Odessa that could be his neighbors in Odessa. And Sol Bellow, the inventor of Moses Elkanah Herzog or Zemler, owes much more to the American writers and thinkers of the 19th century than to his Jewish sources. But is literature the privileged witness to answer such a question, whether Jewish peoplehood is a myth or a reality? So it is hard to think of the works of Celan and the works of his friends Amichai or even Natan Zach as belonging to the same literature. It is not difficult for me, indeed it is easy for me, to think of the people that wrote these literary works, the authors themselves, as belonging to the same people. But will it be that easy in 20 or 30 or 50 years from now? I do not know. For me, the issue of Jewish peoplehood outside territory and language is as enigmatic today as it was hundreds of years ago. Thank you.
Well, as usual, Menahem has given us plenty of food for thought. And we'll doubtless have questions at the end. The next speaker is Professor Anita Norich from the University of Michigan. She's professor of English literature and of Yiddish literature, and at various times has spent long periods here in Jerusalem with us. She's published a number of books. I'm just looking to see their titles, excuse me.
I know them, John.
Yes. Yiddish. Wait a minute. Sorry, I had it all marked. But Discovering Exile, Yiddish and Jewish Culture in America During the Holocaust. A new book. In fact, it's just coming out, Stanford University Press. The Homeless Imagination and the Fiction of Israel Joshua Singer, that is the brother of Isaac Bashevis, published by Indiana in 1991. Anita's subject, Hebraism and Yiddishism, Paradigms of Modern Jewish Literary History.
Thank you. I just want to begin, rather than praising the absent Giddy. Oh no, he's right here. You moved to thank Giddy for this occasion and everyone for the invitation to come back and speak in Jerusalem, which I have sorely missed doing. This is one of the best organized conferences I've been to in a very long time, and I have to say that it is no fault of the organizers that I completely misunderstood the title of Session 5, which you may recall says Contemporary Jewish Cultural Creativity in Israel and the English-Speaking Diaspora, Convergence or Divergence. I thought it said Contemporary Jewish Cultural Creativity in Israel and the Yiddish-Speaking Diaspora, Convergence and Divergence. So this will give you rather more of my talk than you need to know in advance, perhaps. Nonetheless, there it is. In 1974, the Yiddish poet Malka Heifetz Tussman, born in Russia, living in the U.S., published a small volume of poems in Israel. The book, written by a woman who at various times was a Yiddish teacher, an anarchist, a writer of Russian poetry and English essays, was entitled Unter dein Zeichen, Under Your Sign, and it is only one of the reasons she was awarded the Itzik Manga Prize for Yiddish Poetry in 1981. Like much of her poetry, the book enters into many conversations with Yiddish culture, with the nascent Jewish feminist movement, with American literature, even with, as its title suggests, contemporary literary theory. Semiotics informs these poems, as do questions of identity, and most emphatically, desire in all its meanings. In Unter dein Zeichen, Tussman included a poem entitled Almoneschaft, Widowhood. The poem begins, Tu epis mitten Mem in Almone soll nit sein wie a Juk, wie a Muck, skriecht ibe mein Heut und grabbelt Teut, und grabbelt Teut. Tussman's translators agreed about how best to render it into English. Marcia Falk writes, do something to the W in widow, so it won't be like a spider that crawls on my flesh, scratching death, scratching death. In Catherine Hellerstein's translation, the lines read, do something with the W in widow, so it shall not be like a beetle, like a gnat. It crawls over my skin and scratches death and scratches death. Notice how both translators transformed the mem in almone into the W in widow. Despite their different linguistic systems, the morphology of each letter is remarkably similar. Mem and W are mirror images of one another, more or less. They offer the same crawling sense, the same visual form, the same softness, the same proof of translatability. Tussman's poem goes on to make a strong claim to individuality and agency, to the ongoing life of the mind and body. It rejects the category of widow, insisting that what the speaker needs now is not der Barmkeit, the compassion one directs at a widow, but rather Glustung, the passion that the living continue to seek. Passion is the life force, compassion extinguishes it. Harnessing the speaker with the word almone, assuming, almana I hope you now know, assuming that she is understood or known by this sign of mourning and loss is destructive, even deadly. Tussman demands that the world listen fully to the speaker and not to the sign. She insists that identity is more complex and more manifold than the label can ever encompass. It is a message worth heeding, not only when addressing questions of identity, but literary and cultural dynamics as well. Particularly, but not only, for those of us who study Eastern European Jewish culture or Yiddish, the reminder that when our compassion for the fate of our subject is stronger than our passion for it, we are likely to distort it, to impose upon it, to become deaf to the voices we would like to hear. Scholars of Jewish literature have devoted considerable attention to questions of identity, nomenclature, boundaries, and intersections, seeking a definitive identity for the text they study or simply seeking a working definition of their subject. In such discussions, we often find ourselves in the position of accepting the American view of pornography, made famous by Justice Potter Stewart when he said, I shall not attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced, but I know it when I see it. Jewish literature, lahavdil, has been identified in comparably problematic ways. Despite much recent analysis, which I won't explore here in the interest of time, We are no closer to resolving the question of whether Jewish literature really is, as many have argued, literature written by Jews, for Jews, with Jewish themes. Indeed, the question of what constitutes Jewish literature is as intractable as any other question about identity, as likely to engender unsatisfying essentialist definitions as it is to produce imprecise assertions about hybridity or multicultural influences. This dissatisfaction with all the signs that we attach to Jewish literature has nothing to do with the quality of the criticism or theory, but rather with the question itself. It cannot be resolved categorically, but only and always situationally, contextually, changing as the history of the Jews and their lived experiences within or among other groups changes. Concerns about how to identify or analyze modern Jewish literature are often framed by a series of dialectics, or at least juxtapositions, that have a good deal in common. They posit a sense of tensions between Jewish and non-Jewish languages, diglossia and heteroglossia, the cosmopole and the shtetl, diaspora and Zion, derivation and influence. They also posit a set of questions. Is English now a Jewish language? Are Jews most creative when they are at home or when they are outsiders critical of home? Did urbanization or modernization make Jewish identity too diffuse and indistinguishable from others? Is there a distinctly Jewish sense of humor, a Jewish aesthetic, a Jewish voice? What is a Jewish book? These are familiar, truth to tell rather tired, and overlapping questions, primarily asking who is in and who is out of some border that is always necessarily shifting. They underscore a profound anxiety about gatekeeping and permeability. These are not, finally, productive questions, certainly not in literary or cultural terms, partly because they ignore the difference that the literary makes, partly because they are masks for that underlying question of identity, which, as Trestman reminds us, is never a fixed category. The contours of Jewish literature are indeed defined contextually by who is asking, who is answering, and when. Yud Lamed Peretz asked a version of this question in his first published work, the long autobiographical poem Monish. In 1888, he wrote, Anders wollt mein Lied geklungen, ich soll vor Goyim Goyish singen. My song would sound differently if I were to sing in a non-Jewish language for non-Jews. He could not specify just how it would sound, contenting himself with asserting that Yiddish had no language for passion or romance. 20 years later, when Monish was reissued, those words had disappeared from the text. What had changed by 1908 had everything to do with the mass emigration to America, with the Dreyfus Affair, with the First Zionist Congress and the founding of the Bund, with the Kishinev pogrom, with the failed Russian Revolution. In the year of the Chernovitz Conference that proclaimed Yiddish an ethno-national language of the Jews, the distinctiveness and certainly the limitations of Yiddish were no longer at the forefront of Peretz's modernist inquiries. In a radically different context, the questions and foci of his imagination necessarily changed. The inquiry into the characteristics of Jewish literature changes in a similar fashion. The worry about just what is Jewish literature in the modern era is an academic version of the equally problematic who is a Jew question. The answer may appear easy halachically, but is less so politically, sociologically, or culturally. Thus, we run the risk of defining Jewish literature as literature written by Jews and testing our definition by arguing over individuals whose identity is in question. Think of the names often invoked in such discussions. Should Norman Mailer, who was born a Jew, or the converts Heine or Benjamin Disraeli be considered part of a Jewish literary canon? But we might more fruitfully ask what the effects are of including or excluding them, or why the question of including them is so fraught. We are not engaged in a hermeneutic inquiry, but a sociological or political one. If we include these men, have we stretched the category to include nearly everyone with any hint of Jewish blood or even Jewish sympathies? If we exclude them, are we to create a list of Jewishly identifiable markers or thematics that is at least as objectionable as racial markers? Then would Marcel Proust be in or out? What about Anton Chamas? What about George Eliot? Groups are identified as much by who is out as by who is in, and it is often easier to identify what one is not than what one is. This question of belonging and what Jacob Neusner might describe as category formation may be inescapable, but it is not immutable. Hannah Werthnescher's recent reminder about the shifting status of Kafka is illuminating here. Kafka, long understood to be a universal, quintessential modernist, has become a Jewish Czech writer, and all without rising from the dead to change a word of his texts. His identity did not change, but the reading community did, and with it the uses to which he could be put. What is striking about these familiar cases is just how liminal they are, and also how they challenge the very notion of canon. These authors and their texts are either dismissed as not clearly Jewish enough, or admitted in precisely because they reflect the outsider status of the Jew, the Jew's rootlessness or necessary adaptability, his or her, but usually his, status as marginal to the larger culture. There is no agreed-upon canon of modern Jewish letters, Ruth Weiss's recent book notwithstanding. Defining a canon, we understand, is a kind of cultural border control. Borders, we all know, especially here, matter desperately, even, or perhaps especially, in the era that is supposedly post-nationalist but hyper-ethnic, where various sorts of deadly religious fundamentalisms abound, where countries on every continent debate the status of guest workers and the demographic makeup of their citizens. While much attention has been devoted to the liminal cases, scholars and readers never argue about whether Shalom Aleichem or Shai Agnon belong to the Jewish literary canon. Here, too, it might be more productive to question the term canon rather than the term Jewish. Canonicity is not a useful category for post-rabbinic Jewish texts, or more pointedly, for modern literary texts. There is no modern Jewish literary canon because until quite recently, there have been none of the Jewish institutions of power that allow us to make sense of canon formation. In the presence of a Jewish nation, Jewish schools, a Jewish press, we may be able to talk about a canon. In their absence, the term becomes largely meaningless. Canon, of course, implies a kind of unity, or at least community, that does not exist for Jewish culture, spread as it is all over the world and in scores of languages. We will not define Jewish culture because, as has often been noted of late, there is no such useful category, certainly no such universal category. We need instead, as David Beetle among others has written, to speak of Jewish cultures, in the plural, situated again like Tussman in different locations at different times, in contact with varying cultures, influencing and being influenced by them. Ahad Ha'am's distinctions between hikui shel hitarut and hikui shel hitbolalut may also be useful here in helping us avoid the fear of disappearing. Competitive imitation, he reminded us, is unavoidable, even necessary for the vigorous development of any culture. It ought not to be confused with the kind of parasitic assimilation of the majority culture in which the minority is essentially destroyed. The Jew has been read in various symbolic terms, at least since the Enlightenment, probably since Exodus, possibly since the banishment from Eden propelled Jews out of myth and into history. The Jew as parvenu, the Jew as capital, the Jew as sexuality or impotence have been supplemented by the modernist view of the Jew as every alienated man, and more recently by the postmodernist view of the Jew as the sign of indeterminacy. Jean-Paul Sartre, who more than any other philosopher was responsible for giving us the concept of the other, saw the Jew as the product of anti-Semitism, a projection of the anti-Semite's own worst fears. In this, he was not entirely different from the German Wissenschaft philosophers who believed that with the end of anti-Semitism would come the end of Jewish distinctiveness. In America, Bernard Malamud and many, many others saw the Jew as the quintessential modern everyman. Elsewhere, George Steiner embraced exile and the productive tensions to which it leads, while Cynthia Ozick embraced home and homecoming and the conditions that create a lasting culture. The contestations over the locations of the Jewish imagination and the physical Jew have been intense and constant. The philosopher Jean-François Lyotard wrote of Jews in the lower case in order to highlight their symbolic significance to Western culture without confusing them with real historical Jews. Emmanuel Levinas sought for the Jewish ethical foundations embodied in the Talmud as a way of countering the malaise of modernity. These are a not quite random set of prominent figures to which numerous others could be added as representatives of various influential and problematic readings of the Jew. Still, neither the views that suggest the universality of the Jewish condition nor those that privilege its particularity should satisfy us here. Constructions of the Jew as a symbol of or as the thing itself are equally limiting and equally politicized. I want to pose a different tension, one that is best represented by the two Jewish languages that are indisputably important to any discussion of Jewish cultures, Hebrew and Yiddish. I choose them partly because I'm parochial enough to choose them, but the better reason is partly because no one will dispute that they have produced Jewish literatures, and partly because although they seem like more straightforward cases than English, French, German, Arabic, even Ladino, or other Judeo-hyphenated languages, they reveal profound oppositions that are worth exploring. Modern Jewish literary scholarship has often compared the development of Hebrew and Yiddish literature, commenting on the large numbers of writers who wrote in both languages or began in one and switched to the other. The dominant view of Jewish literature has been that at least until the late 19th century, Hebrew and Yiddish comprised one literature, the cultural expression of one people that should not be divided along linguistic lines. The assertion has obvious sociological advantages for any idea of Jewish national unity. What we continue to describe euphemistically as the events of the 20th century is in this view said to have disrupted that essential unity with inescapable consequences. The view of Jewish literary unity was formulated most famously in the 1918 essay Zwei Sprachen, eine einzige Literatur, two languages, only one literature, written by the Yiddish and Hebrew writer Bal Machshavos. It was further explicated by Shmuel Niger in his 1941 book Die Zweisprachigkeit von unserer Literatur, The Bilingualism of Our Literature, in which Niger made bilingualism a defining characteristic of Jewish literatures of all times. But this insistence on essential unity in the midst of obvious diversity has been more recently and vigorously challenged by Dan Miron. Contra these critics and what he has described as Dov Sadan's view of, quote, a dialectical continuity of a unified modern Jewish culture, end quote, Miron has argued that not only were Yiddish and Hebrew not part of one literary system, but that they were antagonistic, aimed at different audiences, subject to different aesthetic and historical influences, fiercely seeking independence from one another, and yet equally informed by the lived, varied experiences of Jews and encounters with Jewish texts. This revision of the dominant view of unity parallels other recent changes in the cultural discussions around Jewish literature. There was a time, quite recently, when critics spent enormous energies showing that Yiddish or Hebrew were just like other Western literary traditions, following similar patterns of development. Only by claiming commensurability could we claim a place for ourselves in the cultural landscape. Along with the melting pot, this claim seems to have changed, as the climate of multicultural discussions more generally has changed. We no longer need to claim likeness in order to claim interest, and we are all more likely to claim equality these days without the prior claim of similarity. Indeed, in our current cultural moment, we tend to assert not the centrality of our authors and texts, but precisely their marginality, their status as unknown or underappreciated masterpieces, misunderstood because they do not quite fit into accepted paradigms. I do not want to make a special claim for Hebrew or Yiddish, but rather to consider something we may call Hebraism and something we may call Yiddishism. We have here a Jewish version of Matthew Arnold's division between Hebraism and Hellenism, although no longer in the service of a Mussashmuz, a lesson in morality or ethics. Arnold, you will recall, understood Hebraism as rooted in tradition and behavior, and Hellenism as more experiential and variable. In a similar but not identical way, Hebraism and Yiddishism suggest potentially different ways of regarding one's place in the world and in world cultures. What I mean by Hebraism here is not a language but a worldview, one that insists on autonomy, that lauds independence, that sees itself as part of an ancient canonized tradition, which it continues and from which it derives its authority. It strives toward assertions of authenticity, particularity, and distinctiveness. Normalcy, security, being one among other nations, to put it in more familiar terms, is predicated on one's status alongside other nations as equals rather than within them. Hebraism seeks to maintain the distinctiveness of Jewish cultural identity and to remind us of its boundaries. It posits Jewish culture as an organic, continuous whole. The view of Hebrew as chauvinist or insular is, under the rubric of Hebraism, understood instead as an affirmation that creative endeavors, even existence itself, is predicated on autonomy and independence. Yiddishism, in contrast, insists on intersections, interdependence, on the virtues of living within other cultures, developing one's own, sometimes tense, relationship with them, contributing to them, influenced by them. It asserts accretion and synthesis as the bases of cultural vibrancy. It prides itself on its abilities to adapt and change. Thus, the sense of some critics that Yiddish literature was derivative of European literatures, unable to develop an independent character, and therefore doomed to imitation and absorption is, under the rubric of Yiddishism, understood instead as openness, adaptability, a multicultural perspective. If by multiculturalism we mean the relationships among a wide range of diverse, distinct cultural influences in which something new is created, then Yiddishism may offer the paradigmatic example of that definition. There is no serious debate nowadays that suggests that Jewish culture has ever been so insular as to be free of non-Jewish sources and influences. But under the sign of Hebraism, the impact of the non-Jewish world is more masked. Diverse sources are made to appear seamless, indistinguishable, part of one organic, continuing whole. Under the sign of Yiddishism, the traces of these sources remain clearer. They create something new, but they leave discernible elements. As in pentamento or palimpsest, these traces may be covered over, but now and then the canvas reveals what came before. If Hebraism represents the clearest marker of necessary boundaries, and Yiddishism the clearest marker of necessary intersections, then the fact that both have and continue to inform Jewish cultures should tell us something about the workings of Jewish culture. Neither maintaining strict boundaries between Jews and others, or looking for points of intersection, are guarantees of anything. Not of viability, not of security, certainly not of ultimate authority. The slipperiness between these two positions is actually a wonderfully productive one that warns against embracing one at the expense of the other. Thus, Niga's insistence on bilingualism can be seen not merely as an attempt by a committed Yiddishist to secure a respectable place for Yiddish at the Jewish cultural table, but also as an argument, actually in the Hebraist vein, in favor of a unified, continuous Jewish cultural tradition. In this, Niga is not so different from Dov Sadan. Miron's rejection of that view, written in Hebrew by a prominent critic of Hebrew and Yiddish culture, is not an attempt to destroy any notion of Jewish literature, but rather to expand its parameters to see diversity where others see unity. These are, I would suggest, not mutually exclusive perspectives, but mutually necessary ones. It is worth recalling Avram Sutzkever's haunting questions, understood as a post-Holocaust inquiry into the traces of his lost world. Wer wird bleiben? Was wird bleiben? Who will remain? What will remain? The poet asks. The Israeli Yiddish writer concludes that God will remain, but his emphasis is not religious. He assures us not only that religious practice and belief, along with fantasy and words, will all remain, but also that the questions themselves matter, and they will remain. More definitive answers do us a disservice because they distance us from the wider net appropriately cast by the range of languages and experiences of the Jewish imagination. It is certainly time to move away from the either-or questions and the yes-no responses they seek. Is she or is he not a Jewish writer? Is this or is this not a Jewish text? A more productive inquiry would examine diachronic shifts even as it compares Jewish communities synchronically. It would privilege conversation over debate, multiplicity over clarity. It would, in short, be appropriately located in current critical and theoretical discussions, even as it is firmly grounded in Hebrew and Yiddish sources and those of the territorial languages of Jewish history. What remains of the attempt to define Jewish culture is the ongoing examination of a wide range of experiences, influences, contexts of Jewishness and Judaism in the modern era. The rest, as Rabbi Hillel said in a different context, is merely commentary. Thank you.
There's a question of whether or not we can use the screen, so we'll take a break for a minute. Done? Yeah. Modern technology, apparently the material has come through. So our next speaker is Sidra, Professor Sidra, actually Dekoven-Ezrahi, no more as Sidra Ezrahi, from the Hebrew University. She's also been for the last few years partially a visiting professor at Duke University in the United States. Among her books, I have it here, we have By Words Alone, The Holocaust in Literature, a very well-known book, Booking Passage, Exile and Homecoming in Modern Jewish Imagination, a whole huge slew of articles and other works. As with our other two speakers, very distinguished record. Her subject, Europe, Israel and America, the global theater of Jewish tragedy, epic and comedy in the 20th century. Well, good luck. Yeah.
In the 20th century in 20 minutes. First of all, I want to thank Shmuel for his heroic efforts to help me with this little brief slideshow that we're going to have to wake us all up. No offense, no offense. It's late in the morning. First, I want to apologize, but I think we've all gone beyond the supposed scope of this panel, which was supposed to be limited to Jewish cultural creativity in Israel and the English-speaking diaspora, and I think we've all gone beyond those bounds, and I certainly will, and I've allowed myself a synoptic view, which I think is very much in the spirit, if not the letter, of my dear colleague Giddy's work. And it's also something of a bird's-eye view of my own work over the last few decades, so bear with me, and I hope you don't get seasick or airsick. Yuri Sleskin, in his recent book, The Jewish Century, traces the putative journeys of Tevye's 5 daughters, or the putative journeys of Tevye's putative 5 daughters. We never know how many daughters he has. From Sleskin's perspective, no matter where the daughters went, to the cities of revolutionary Russia, to the deserts of Palestine, or to the gold-paved streets of America, they continued to be haunted by the ghost of Karl Marx. But few people know that the ship that brought Tevye's daughter Belka and her no-goodnik husband Padatsur to America had a stowaway, Karl's half-brother Groucho, who would, after arrival, take charge of the American century. And I have a picture of him here. No, wait a minute. Now what do I do? He's the one in the middle. Meanwhile, just off the boat in Yafo and looking for agricultural work among the Moshavot, we find the Marx's cousin, Yitzchak Kumer, whose ascent from Galicia to the Holy Land was powered by prophetic verses and Zionist slogans, Livnot ulehibanot mimena. Livnot ulehibanot mimena. That's from Agnon's Tikkun. And there he is. There's Yitzchak Kumer, so to speak. Another cousin, Bruno Schulz, will never leave Galicia, the little town of Drohobitz to be exact, though his imagination will carry him beyond all laws of gravity, time, and space. All three of these figures, one of whom is fictional, are in their 20s in the second decade of the 20th century. Only one of them will die a natural death, and no, it is not the fictional character. Bruno will be killed by the Nazis, Isaac by the logic of his name. Groucho will finally succumb to mortality at the ripe old age of 87. I'm going to go back to Groucho. Leave him up for a while. Groucho Marx, then, survived the middle decades of the century mainly because he was neither a Jew in Europe nor a character in an Agnon novel. While he was perfecting his shtick, the post-vaudeville version of the Jewish comedy of make-believe, tragic and epic dramas were being enacted on other stages under other mustaches. In the 25 or so minutes at my disposal, I'm going to argue that from our lofty perch at the beginning of the third millennium, the century that just passed can be seen as having accommodated three different generic possibilities on three continents, embodied in Bruno, Groucho, and Isaac. Europe became the theater of the Jewish tragedy, America of the Jewish comedy, and Israel of the Jewish epic. No less remarkable is the exhaustion of each of these modes towards the end of the 20th century, as America's comic imagination gives way to the tragicomic or the tragic, as Israeli authors explore the dystopic, anti-epic, or tragic dimensions of the Israeli-Palestinian landscape, and as Europe is mined once again for its comic possibilities. On the face of it, this argument is based on the problematic premise that history is inherently generic, that, to quote Hayden White, sets of real events are intrinsically tragic, comic, or epic, that the facts of the matter set limits on the kinds of stories that can be properly, in the sense of both voraciously and appropriately told about them, that events themselves possess a story kind of form and a plot kind of meaning, unquote. White helps us to interrogate such premises without yielding to either unself-critical positivism or fatuous relativism. The question of the emplotment of history is, of course, too complex to undertake in the limited framework of this paper, but I will return to it as it informs the idea that out of the vast resources of Jewish civilization, certain generic impulses are realized in different times and places, like the poetic imagination that flourished in Andalusia in the 12th century, or, as Eric Gruen has demonstrated, the comic, parodic sensibility that characterized Hellenistic Jews of the last 3 centuries before the dawn of the Common Era. The question before us can be stated more or less as follows. Do we identify the generic impulses that appear to dominate certain times and places as deriving from or as driving historical forces? On Ellis Island, the portal separating the old world from the new, Karl Marx's earnest vision and Kafka's hapless character Karl Rossmann were disinfected, along with lice and various eye diseases. In fact, the entire European Jewish narrative, penal colonies, tears, and all, would undergo radical detoxification on their way to America and the nature theater of Oklahoma. In Yafo, on the other hand, the portal to Eretz Yisrael, the Schlemiel was effectively banned from entering and contaminating the Zionist enterprise with his particular form of Jewish humor. Nathan Alterman's poem Michtav Shel Menahem Mendel, published in his column in Davar in March 1945, pronounced a benign but final eulogy over Shalom Aleichem's characters along with his readers. This is part of a more subtle transaction between the Jews of Europe and of Eretz Israel that would also profoundly affect their American Jewish confrères. The United States could become the theater of Jewish comedy early in the 20th century, partly because of the confluence of Jewish impulse and American ethos of character and contingency, and partly because America fell under the radar of the grand narrative of Golus and Geula, or Galut and Geula, of exile and redemption. Golus was Europe, which was about to find its tragic end. Geula was Palestine, which was about to find its epic resolution. America was something else, something undefined, a changeling, and an open-ended story. Writing in the New York Yiddish paper Das Yiddisches Tagblatt in 1912, Shalom Aleichem mused on the power of home. Time doesn't weaken it. The ocean can't obliterate it. Freedom won't make you forget it. On the contrary, the farther away you are, the more you want to know what's going on over there in our unfortunate home. How are our unlucky brothers and sisters managing to bear the yoke of exile? Unquote. The implication is that the yoke of exile does not extend to America. The American diaspora is the place to which the Jews of Eastern Europe are self-exiled from their home in Golus. As a voluntary condition, as the place of freedom, such exile carries neither the bitterness of persecution nor the promise of redemption. America, then, the theater of Jewish comedy. For the most part, the Jewish writer's love affair with America in the 20th century was fully requited. Sleskin writes that of the three great Jewish migrations, the American was the only non-revolutionary option. It was, he says, a familiar utopia, an Odessa minus the Tsar and the Cossacks, a place where anyone could become a Rothschild or a Brodsky, or perhaps an Einstein, unquote. Why utopia? And why familiar? Because, I submit, America was the country that accommodated the utopian impulse in the comic mode. What we identify as Jewish humor may have evolved in Eastern Europe as recently as the late 19th century, if we accept Hillel Halkin's hypothesis, but its premises and impulses are as old as Purim. I have argued at length elsewhere, elaborating on theories of diaspora by Daniel Boyarin and others, that America was utopia as a comic proposition, a perpetual Purimspiel. A Jew in Odessa, or more to the point in Kasrilivke, could dress up as a Rothschild or even a Cossack once a year and take revenge on his fate, if not on the Cossack himself. America, on the other hand, is, as Shalom Aleichem's Mottel, the cantor's son, put it, the place where every day is Purim. You'll notice that Shalom Aleichem's characters whirl out into the harbor in New York after proper disinfection. As the only utopian but non-redemptive or non-revolutionary option that the migrating Jews had, America was also paradoxically the form of utopia that the Jews knew most intimately. Utopia as deferred messianism. Ve'af al pi sheyitmamea. Not in spite of, but because the Messiah tarries, I have time to play, to try things out, to dress up. But this time, if the costumes fit, I get to keep it. Like other Americans, Jews contract into American political and aesthetic culture through what Sack van Berkowitz calls rites of ascent. There is in this ethos an affirmation of the material world as given, the discovery of America, and as historically becoming rather than as providentially promised or recovered from some ancient narrative. All of Shalom Aleichem's progeny, of all of Shalom Aleichem's progeny, the 9-year-old Mottel provides the best sight of the unfolding comedy. Mottl's European narrative is entirely counter-historical. Mir ist gut, ich bin a Yosem. It is well with me, I am an orphan, is the way the young boy announces that his father has just died. The chapters located in the shtetl and on the journey to America are under the sign of a massive negation, a rewriting of the world. But from the moment he lands with both feet on American soil, Motl fills all spaces, physical and linguistic, with the uncontroverted facts of American materialism. He has landed firmly in the only place where reality need not be stood on its head or redeemed. As a contractual, ever-evolving, voluntary association, the American exile will provide the launching pad for a number of open-ended Jewish journeys. Border crossings embedded in audacious acts of impersonation and transgression stretch across the 20th century, from Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer in the 3rd decade through Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint in the 7th. Breathtaking flights of cultural and religious amalgamation animate the prose and poetry of Grace Paley and E.L. Doctorow. One of the aspects of the comic figure, especially in his American Jewish incarnation, is that he lives close to the ground. Whether he is selling bananas or slipping on their peels, he does not hover high over the surface of life like a figure in a Chagall canvas, but focused his attention myopically on the surfaces of the world in which he lives. As Michael Bachtin defines it, everything that makes us laugh is close at hand. All comical creativity works in a zone of maximal proximity. Laughter demolishes fear and piety before an object, before a world, making of it an object of familiar contact and thus clearing the ground for an absolutely free investigation of it, unquote. In Mottl's narrative, domestic spaces are linguistic carnivals as well as culinary laboratories. After a few months in America, his mother gets everything backwards, cooking a kitchen and a chicken, finally laughing at herself. A beer weiß, dass bei mir is a chicken is a kitchen and a kitchen is a chicken. What's the difference? Grace Paley's kitchen stories, written a few decades later, feature two husbands disappointed by eggs. Granted, the price for paying such close attention is that it is hard to keep one's mind on the distant object of desire. I cannot keep my mind on Jerusalem, begins the poem by Paley entitled Vengeance. I cannot keep my mind on Jerusalem. It wanders off like an idiot with no attention span to whatever city lies outside my window that day. Damascus, the libraries of Babylonia. Oh, the 5 exogamous boroughs of our beloved home, New York. What will happen when the Lord remembers vengeance, which is his, and finds me? Whoops. Sorry about that. I have to learn to do this. Israel, theater of the Jewish epic. The Jews in Palestine, for their part, were trying to readjust to the earth and sky and smell and the time and the seasons of an ancestral home. Agriculture, like archaeology, was a form of attention to what was both proximate and remote, to the remote object of desire manifested as the ground beneath one's feet. As it turned out, by overturning the soil of an ancient narrative, the Jews also placed themselves in the force field of the Lord's vengeance. Nowhere is this more poignantly enacted than in the great epic of modern Hebrew literature, Shai Agnon's Tmol Shilshom, that was recently, or just yesterday, translated as Only Yesterday. The epic genre has undergone serious reconsiderations over the past half-century. For both Michael Bachtin and Walter Benjamin, the epic in its prose form was understood as having been superseded by the novel. In Benjamin's words, the novel emerged from the womb of the epic. Bachtin welcomes this development as a move into a more polyphonic social space, while Benjamin laments the passing of a genre that to him reflected the continuities of oral culture and the place of the storyteller. More recent post-colonial interrogations of the genre link epic and empire in ways that David Quint both demonstrates and refines in his book by that name. The epic is that form which is in the business of producing master narratives, argues Quint. The equation of power and the very possibility of narrative is a defining feature of the genre, unquote. Tmol draws, like most of Agnon's fictions, on written texts collectively referred to as an oral tradition, which establishes a natural link to the epic form. But unlike other fictions by Agnon, this novel's structure, as adumbrated in its opening passage, ratifies the utopian vision of sovereignty as textually derived, transmitted as received wisdom, in Bakhtin's terms, as memory rather than epistemology, and at the same time as the motor for action in the world. And this is the way the novel opens in Barbara Harshav's English translation. Like all our brethren of the second Aliyah, the bearers of our salvation, Isaac Kummer left his country and his homeland and his city and ascended to the land of Israel to build it from its destruction and to be rebuilt by it. Livnot ulehivanot mimena. A blessed dwelling place was his image of the whole land of Israel and its inhabitants blessed by God. By day they plow and sow and plant and reap and gather and pick, threshing wheat and pressing wine, and at eventime they sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, his wife and his sons and daughters sitting with him, happy at their work and rejoicing in their sitting, and they reminisce about the days of yore. The novel, which appeared in the original Hebrew in 2 volumes in 1945-46, seemed to satisfy the expectations of 2 generations of Zionist architects and laborers for a social panorama of the second Aliyah cast in world historical terms. The debate over the generic niche that Tmol Shilshom inhabits still absorbs critics after 60 years. Yet hardly anyone questions the perception that this novel is indeed a vessel through which the ambitions of Jewish nationalism found their narrative. It appears, on the surface anyway, to combine all the elements of a modern epic, centering around events of great significance to the community, drawing upon oral traditions, and focused on deeds of grandeur or heroism narrated with verisimilitude. Jerusalem, which Baruch Kurzweil called the telos of Agnon's entire epic oeuvre, is the site of both the protagonist's personal fulfillment and his death. There are nevertheless many problems with the approach to the novel as epic, not the least of which is the stature of Yitzchak Kummer, whom you may recall we left looking for work among the moshavot around Yafo. As anyone who has read the novel knows, he did find work, though not as a chalutz, but as a house painter. And he did eventually find happiness, though not in the cafes of Yafo or in the arms of the seductive Sonia, but in the recesses of Mea Sharim and in the modest bosom of Shifra. His deeds and mien are that of a very average man. He is no Homer or Odysseus or Tancred. Even Leopold Bloom is several notches above him. Kummer's character and his fate are in many ways subversive of the epic claims of the narrative. And his death from rabies, while unleashing the rains on a drought-parched land and providing a cosmic resolution, actually fits the tragic, sacrificial more than the epic mode. It anticipates in mid-century the migration at century's end of the generic impulses we have been tracing to their default modes, and we will return to this in a minute. Europe, theater of the Jewish tragedy. When we return to Europe as the theater of the Jewish tragedy, we may need to remind ourselves that we read even Kafka's European stories through the dark backshadowing lens of a post-war world that needed him as its prophet. Through this lens, Kafka's death from tuberculosis in 1924 almost seems like a waste, when he could have lived to die a more perfect death in a concentration camp, or be shot in the streets of his town like Bruno Schulz. No doubt about it, Europe in mid-century is history as tragedy, especially for the Jews. For several decades after the liberation of the camps, the enormity of the tragedy stifled any poetic or artistic alternatives. Certainly, any realistic representation of this period would only enhance the knowledge that, as Frederick Jameson puts it, history is what hurts. For Jews, the Shoah is what hurts supremely. From the beginning, there was, especially in Yiddish and Hebrew representations of the events, an additional generic resource derived from a long tradition of lamentational literature. Within a few decades after the war, the traces of Jewish death in Europe began to replace Jerusalem as sites of pilgrimage, homage, and monumental gestures. Latter-day Avalei Zion came to worship at these newly ruined shrines with ancient rituals and texts. It was this homage that belatedly embraced the writings of Bruno Schulz, the arts and crafts teacher turned writer who came to the attention of non-Polish readers through the auspices of Philip Roth and Jerzy Fikowski. And this is one of his drawings. The playful fancy of his fictions and drawings was forced into the Procrustean bed of his tragic fate. As David Goldfarb puts it, if you ask most people who have heard his name, who was Bruno Schulz, they will typically respond in the passive voice. Bruno Schulz, the Polish-Jewish author of brilliant phantasmagoria, was gunned down by a Nazi officer in the Drohobitz ghetto in 1942. This answer, continues Goldfarb, projects a teleology backward onto the artist's work. Schulz may be remembered most for the horrifying act of which he was not the author, but which fits a popular stereotype of his race: brilliant, frail, passive, tragic. 50 years have passed since Schulz's death, yet what can we say of his life?" Unquote. Well, quite a lot, actually. A radical shift is taking place in the new encounters with texts by writers who were caught by the Holocaust, such as Bruno Schulz. Adam Zagajewski invites us to recognize that, quote, in Schulz's prose, provincial Drohobitz, which doesn't exist anymore, was transformed into some sort of eastern Baghdad, into an exotic city out of 1001 Nights. Schulz's imagination is encircled by enemies, yet we can now acknowledge he does not foresee the war. He does not foresee his own death. His message is delicate and reveals itself only to trusting readers in the act of reading, unquote. Of the various attempts by contemporary writers to appropriate the life of Bruno Schulz, David Grossman adapts Schulz's destiny to his craft, so that his metamorphic afterlife as a salmon serves to both represent the workings of his own imagination and to detoxify his hideous death. The effect of this magical act in a Hebrew narrative of Holocaust survivors is augmented by the appearance of none other than Motel, the cantor's son, who, you may recall, was effectively banned, along with Shalom Aleichem's other progeny, from entering the Hebrew Republic in 1945. 40 years later, in Sea Under Love, he sneaks into Momek's mind as contraband. Together, Bruno and Momek stage a putsch to reinstate the old Jewish humor. In England, meanwhile, a dramatization of Schulz's Street of the Crocodiles at London's Complicité Theatre in the early 1990s was hijacked by the spirit of the author. Director Simon McBurney relates that during the rehearsal, the objects began to dominate. They took over the room, filling pockets in the insides of the actors' hats or under their tables. Umbrellas, book sprouting feathers, boots, shirts, plates, glasses, and cutlery. In retrospect, I realize that Schulz's vision evokes the transforming power of the child's eye, unquote. Once again, as in Grace Paley's comic vision, attention is paid to what is directly outside one's window or in front of one's nose. That is, even though all the props and characters had assembled for the tragic historical denouement in Schulz's hometown and in every town and metropolis in Europe, Schulz's ultimate fate may yet live in the delicate confections of his imagination. Aya yachol liyot acheret. Admittedly undermining the force of my own neat generic schema, I take as my concluding inspiration the title of Amos Elon's History of German Jewry, The Pity of It All, not the inevitability of it all. History, seen as a series of contingencies, will resist enfolding Bruno Schulz's enchanted stories and drawings into his absurd fate, resist the attraction of a kind of fatal coherence between history and imagination. Indeed, toward the end of the century, there is a perceptible shake-up in all the centers of Jewish culture. A strangely redemptive sensibility is emerging in Europe, in the comic, carnivalesque mode, beginning with the restitution of the status of the literary word to combat the fate of the victims of fascism. A series of counter-historical narratives have imagined the world as it might have been, from Ulrich Becker's Jacob the Liar, through Benini's Life is Beautiful, Michaelino's Train de Vie, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Train de Vie, I know, I know. And the Akko Theater's Arbeit macht frei, writers, filmmakers, and performers have underscored the fact not only that Haya yachol liot acheret, but that one of the imperatives of the post-war reconstruction of Jewish life is the restoration of laughter after. In Israel, Grossman's own comic muse survives just barely under the weight of a growing sense of tragedy, his own and ours. The Israeli cultural climate in the second half of the last century contains more currents of the tragic or apocalyptic kind that Terry Eagleton identifies with the sweet violence of the religious imagination than the epic story of rebirth and empire that characterized the first half. Like Oedipus or Lear, Agnon's Isaac appears on our rereading as the sacrificial figure, the pharmakos, his fate, as Benjamin put it, the performative act which brings a new social order into being, a terrible new social order. In 1945, then, Agnon both enacted and deconstructed the Zionist epic, bringing it dangerously close to the altar on which Isaac's brethren in Galicia had just been sacrificed, and dangerously relevant to our own millennial cast of mind. And one of the Comédies Américaines at the end of the century, or at the turn of the millennium. For one, many of the younger writers, including Englander, Bucchi at Four, and Krauss, are mining Europe for its other stories and its as yet unscarred landscapes. At the same time, there is an exploration of the darker side of the American promise, captured by none other than Philip Roth in his most recent series of novels. Roth inaugurated the new century by revealing a sinister dead end for the very acts of freedom that he and his contemporaries had celebrated with such gusto in the 1960s and 1970s. If from the jazz singer to the human stain we can trace the move from blackface to whiteface, from the Jew impersonating the black to the African American impersonating the Jew, we can now calculate the escalating price of such transactions. The human stain exacts its full pound of flesh, while the mask on the face of both Al Jolson and Coleman Silk signifies trust in the American promise of self-invention. The latter will be avenged by forces enacting a form of dramatic justice, the triumph of fate over freedom. The terms of reference in this novel come transparently from the canons of Western culture and the structure from Sophoclean tragedy. The Jewish novelist creates an African-American character to assume the identity of a white Jew, are you following? And then abdicates by submitting the whole Geschichte to a higher authority, the Greeks, vindicating both their version of the story and their place in the pantheon. In so doing, Roth in a way abdicated his own place in the American pantheon and in Groucho's family album. Just months before the Twin Towers fell, and a few years before the military adventure in Iraq, as the great American promise began to sour under the burden of empire, the grapes of Roth ripened and fermented, and the American Jewish drama began to move from comedy or satire towards tragedy. Coleman Silk is finally ensnared by the stranglehold of history that is one's own time, blindsided by the terrifyingly provisional nature of everything, unquote. Would I go so far then as to say that history is indeed implotted, that the radical shifts in generic sensibilities in the different centers of Jewish culture at the end of the 20th century reflect tectonic shifts in historical realities? Can Europe in the 21st century provide the stage for the reinvented Jewish comedy? Is America indeed giving up its comic muse? In embracing a more tragic Sophoclean vision, is it in danger of turning its back on the lessons of imperial overreach that Aristophanes and his fellow masters of comedy tried and failed to teach the Athenians some 2,500 years ago? And most important for those of us in this room, is the Zionist narrative realizing the worst of Agnon's verdicts, transforming its epic utopian vision into the sweet violence of sacrificial tragedy? Thank you.
Well, we certainly had a lot of food for thought, and I hope we have time for discussion and questions. Anyone? Yes, Stephanie. Should people come up here? Yeah.
No, it's okay. I'll just start out.
Can you hear over there?
Yeah, with one
Talk
question
up.
to Menahem Brinker. All right, I apologize before I start. I wonder, I would like to sort of question the need to use these kind of exclusive criteria to reach a judgment about whether there is Jewish peoplehood or not, on the basis particularly of those terms of territoriality and language, which sort of almost smack of certain Stalinist definitions of what is a nation or not, and rather question whether, I mean, as one example rather than as an all-encompassing, but in terms of whether there are certain Jewish, if not values, issues, cultural baggage. And as an example, I would say, I mean, you were saying that Jewish writers in America have to be more American than Jewish. But there is now, as has been noted, for example, in a recent article in Midstream, a whole group of American writers who are actually religious Jews and who, in their writing, refer not only to, let's say, American situations, but to issues that refer back to Talmudic questions or part of the Jewish tradition as embodied in current literature. And I would question whether one can't then say, if writers elsewhere are also dealing with similar issues, and there is perhaps some kind of Jewish communality that goes beyond language and territory.
Okay, if there are, we'll take a couple more questions if there are any, and then yes. Hello? Yeah.
I have a question for Anita. You seem to pose a kind of a dichotomy with regard to Kafka.
To all three of you, I mean, am I right in saying that all of you, in a way, were moving some kind of deconstructionist theory or deconstructionist undertaking to get away from trying to generalize about national literatures, certainly try to refocus on specific works and specific writers in specific periods? Or is that a misreading of, is that a generalization which you would reject? Are there any other questions? I know that people probably want to get to lunch. But all right, so Menahem, maybe come up here. It's easy for people.
Just to remind the first speaker that I didn't say anything prescriptive. I didn't recommend any way of looking at the problem. I just described some distinctive elements of Hebrew literature, and especially Hebrew literature written in the land of Israel. And I also raised the question whether we should judge the issue of whether there is a Jewish peoplehood, whether it is a myth or reality, according to literature. That's all, and express my view. Stalin essays, as I know, about the language and territory, here we have an expert on Marxist thought, was written in 1912, as far as I remember, 30 or 40 years before that. The fathers of Chibat Zion, even before political Zionism, insisted that a real nation must have a common language and a common territory, so that the Jews are an historical group. For them, the Jews were an historical group, but not a real nation. And to become a real nation, they must share territory and language. It was long before Stalin was born. And I think it was not a bad idea that the Jews would have a common territory and common language. Disappointed with some aspects of Zionism as we are, we must also celebrate its achievements. Now, whether the Talmud is meaningful to most of the Jewish writers I had in mind that write outside Israel, I don't think it has any significance for most of the Jewish writers that write in English or French or Russian or Italian or whatever. Here it may have significance. Why? Because as inheritors of modern Hebrew literature and of Hebrew language, the quarrel with the Talmud, the negative attitude to the Talmud, but the knowledge of the Talmud, or the knowledge at least of what it was, is part of Hebrew consciousness and of modern Hebrew literature. And the Talmud is much more significant, I think, to the writers and poets that write in Hebrew in Israel than to most Jewish writers that write elsewhere. Now, to turn to Talmud into the one or only foundation of Jewish culture, I think this wouldn't be acceptable by most Jews today, and as it wouldn't be acceptable by most Israeli writers and poets of today. But if linguistically, remnants of the Talmud and the Mishnah, the only intertextual relatedness, not only to the Mishnah but also to the Talmud that I know in Jewish literature, is here, in Hebrew and in Israel. Whether this, but I have no recommendations to make, really. I don't know. I don't know even if it is good that there would be a Jewish people all over the world. For example, Theodor Herzl thought it's bad. He thought that establishing the state of the Jews should hurry up the process of assimilation for those that don't want to belong to the Jewish people or to the Jewish nation. And of course, it is always, there are many more disharmonies in the relationship between Israel and Jews in the outside Israel than we recognize or than we wish to acknowledge in our conferences, usually. So I didn't recommend anything. I just described the situation in literature, those writers that I know. I mentioned only writers that I know their work. There are for each one that I know his work, there must be 20 that I don't know their work. And from the point of view of literature, you cannot say whether there will be two peoples in 50 years or one people, or the diaspora will go its way, Israel will go its way, well, whether it will be still considered as one people, I simply don't know. I'm not playing the ironic part. I simply don't know. I know that much public relations and money is invested in establishing the category of Jewish peoplehood, but I still have doubts about it.
Can you hear me from here?
No.
Jonathan can't hear me from here. I want to thank Debbie Weissman for that question because it lets me clarify something that I wanted to be really insistent about. I agree completely that the most effective way to look at Kafka is both as a universalist and as a Jewish Czech. What I was describing was a historical shift in reader response and reception toward him. That somewhere in the 20th century, Kafka was a universalist. Somewhere else in the 20th century, he became a particularist, and that kind of shift, I think, is precisely the danger in looking at cultural phenomena, that we categorize. This is not just a question of taste. Is George Eliot popular or is she not? It really is a question of identity that changes not because the writer changes or because the writer belongs to one or the other category, but because there are cultural or social needs for it. And in the same way that I wouldn't, I do this sometimes in class, and it's maybe not a good idea, but I ask students to vote. Are you universalists or particularists? And hopefully they get into a huge dilemma and have an identity crisis, and then we can actually talk about stuff. But it's like the myth or reality. Is the Jewish peoplehood a myth or a reality? Are we talking about convergence or divergence? I think in all of those cases, the only way that we can honestly answer is by saying yes. That's partly in response to Jonathan's question. Also, I don't think I don't want to speak for the rest of the panel, although I wouldn't mind trying it in this way. I don't think I certainly don't identify myself as a deconstructionist. This is what cultural critics are always accused of being. I rather think that I was trying to be a constructionist here. That is, that there are these whole series, or maybe a reconstructionist here. They're not in that sense. Sorry. That there are all of these. What you said quietly, if I may quote you, while Sidra was setting up, was. I think exactly to the point that I'm not at least trying to create some generalizable notion of Jewish literary nationality, either territorial or extraterritorial, or even linguistic or extra-linguistic, but rather, as you said, is what you want just to get on with it, which is rather what I want. I think there's a lot more to be gained by looking at these texts in whatever languages they appear and wherever they are written, and dealing with the questions that we're asking, either about Jewish or national or Jewish national or peoplehood or ethnicity or identity through the texts themselves, rather than looking at some broad theory of this is what a Jewish text looks like, now let's go find it. Which seems to me precisely in the other direction. So, I'm not interested in generalizable theories about Jewish literature at this moment, but I am very, very, very interested, and not only as a Yiddishist, but also as that, in getting on with it. I'm going to go around.
I actually have only one thing to say, which maybe an attempt, and since I wasn't a question that was directly at me, I would just say that partly in response to your question, I wasn't sure of the question, but let me just try to say that no, because I for one was identifying three centers of Jewish culture, but they're very, very slippery. And in a way, I think, based also on what Anita just said, that I would say at least what interests me particularly is the afterlife of texts. And in the text that I brought, the afterlife of Kafka, of Schulz, of Agnon, not only in their own communities, of course Schulz's community doesn't exist, and even if there are some Jews now back in Poland, Drohobych certainly hasn't been reconstructed, but how these writers and their texts continue to animate us, how in rereading the text we also discover other generic impulses that we may be acting out in our own lives. So that's as interesting to me as national questions or questions of some sort of provenance in literature.
All right, so thank you very much for 3 excellent papers and fascinating papers. And now we break for lunch. Theoretically, the next session begins at 3. Actually, as it's only 25 to 2, I assume that the session will indeed begin at 3.